Marco, first of all, thanks for helping.
Thanks for arranging everything.
Yes, because this was organized by two projects, as you know. One is the RESQTOOL project that I'm representing here now, but we have the coordinator Keane there sitting. And the other one is Bloom.
Unfortunately, we don't have a banner, but we
Yes.
have the presentation, so it's almost the same.
First of all, thanks for being here, the speakers first of all, but also the participants. And this is something that as EPMA we wanted to do, as our Congress is normally talking about powder metallurgy. Powder metallurgy is clearly linked to the raw materials because at least it uses raw materials. We also, as a community, have the need of securing the supply chain for the materials that we need to use. And not only for, let's say, the exotic or very special materials, but even for some common alloys that contain copper, for instance, that could be a problem in the future. And so we wanted to have also a raw materials part in our Congress so that we could, let's say, extend our view of the supply chain to the upstream part, which is critical for us. And then we found Bloom because we also have another project which is called REPTIS, where we are asked even to collaborate. And yeah, maybe Mark, if you want to say a few words. I know you're speaking later, but...
Thanks, Bruno. Just a quick introduction. My name is Marco Komac, and I would like to thank Bruno for inviting us here. I represent INTRO, which is International Raw Materials Observatory, and it basically deals with critical raw materials in not only Europe, but on a global scale, because we have international constituents. And I think it's a good combination, the same as Bruno has pointed out, to also try to link with this part of industry, which has never been done before, at least as far as I know. And this is a great opportunity to share ideas, to bring some new sparkling ideas for the future and the cooperation potentials. And based on that, I'll just conclude that I also represent the Bloom project, which is co-organizing this workshop, which I'm positive is going to be a successful one, especially because we have so many different presentations, keynote speeches, and at the end, roundtable, which we will have to sort of form because there are only square tables around, but nevertheless.
We will carry some chairs.
We'll do something. Okay, thank you very much, and please, Bruno, you're the chair.
Yeah,
I leave the floor to you.
Let's take this parent role. First of all, some housekeeping. The whole thing, as you know, is video recorded, and you had to agree for GDPR reasons. So you will find all this later in our websites, RESQTOOL, Bloom, on YouTube. And so you will be able to rewatch or let your colleagues watch it. Yeah, we have to start, I think, because we need to listen to many speakers today. And we start with a scenario block where we have 4 speakers invited. And I'm very happy to call to the stage the first one, which is Enzo. Enzo Satkuru, I don't know what's your accent there.
Either or, really.
Granzella.
That's what Granzella is.
And yeah, I can start your presentation. It should go directly there, and then you have your remote.
Great, it's just, okay, nice and easy.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Bruno. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite. I'm not too familiar with either of the sort of Horizon projects sort of on showcase today, so very much looking forward to hearing other speakers later on, hearing about your organizations and what you do in your day-to-day, and I guess really just exploring the riveting topic, as always, of critical raw materials. So in the UK context, I'll be referring to CRMs as critical minerals, but effectively it's the same thing. So just to begin a little bit on the Critical Minerals Association. So we're based here in the UK, we're based in London. We are a membership organisation that has been going for some years now, since around 2019, I believe. Currently at about 40 members, and we represent members throughout the supply chain. So we have mining majors, juniors, recyclers, universities, and then services companies as well, consultancies, EPCMs, legal, finance groups, so on and so forth. The general output in a day-to-day context of the Critical Minerals Association is based around our 5 working groups, which are listed there. And they tend to sort of have sort of different outputs. So some of those are sort of white papers, policy recommendations, and also hosting events. So we also work quite closely with other organizations based internationally. We have sister organizations in the US and Australia, and a blanket sort of umbrella organization called the CMIA. We also have a partner organization in Canada called the C2M2A. And these effectively all do a very similar thing, membership organizations working with different constituent members and so on and so forth. We also work quite closely with the International Energy Agency, the Natural History Museum in London, the G7, the Commonwealth, IOM3, so on and so forth. And finally, I guess in the parliamentary context, we also serve as secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Critical Minerals. And APPGs here in the UK are effectively a crossbench, not quite a committee, but effectively an informal talk shop across all the different political parties on critical minerals. So that's sort of the parliamentary engagement side of things. And this is sort of our membership cohort here, which I think is our most recent. As you can see, there's some majors on there, miners in the mining context, but also, you know, a whole range of different stakeholders across the supply chain. I'm going to apologise in advance for talking about policy on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, but if you can bear with me for sort of 10, 15 minutes, hopefully there'll be some at least slightly interesting insights which could sort of lend some idea of where this is going next for the UK and the potential sort of strategic alignment with peers and nation-state partners, so both with the European Union but also sort of the US and so on and so forth. So perhaps a brief history of where this kind of started, or at least a brief recent history of where this started, is probably the best place to start. So in 2022, around this time, there was an entity called the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, which was set up, and they worked out of the British Geological Society. And this was sort of really the first key step in formulating something that resembles a cohesive critical mineral strategy here in the UK. So under the previous government, the first strategy was released in 2022. It had a list of 18 different minerals, and generally, you know, was received as providing a fairly useful overarching framework within the context. However, if we sort of think back to 2022, you know, the EU was already sort of almost finalising the CRMA. USGS in the US had already sort of released the list, and, you know, these things were all kind of, the UK was kind of behind, it knew it was behind, and there was sort of a bit of an impetus to sort of catch up, as it were. And this was kind of the first step in doing that. There's a quote there from the Foreign Affairs Committee the year after, which really kind of highlighted some of the shortcomings, I guess, in the initial strategy. So then what government does the year after that to reinforce its commitment to critical minerals, and this is something that previous government did quite a lot, was that they would sort of launch these refreshes, these strategy refreshes. And it did some quite good things. It launched something called a Task and Finish group, which really tried to look at those policy gaps. But again, there were some shortcomings in that process. At the beginning of the process, the scope was much larger. It was really, truly ambitious. You know, it was going to involve mapping supply chains in really sort of very intricate detail, engaging both the public and private sector very heavily to do so. And it was quite substantially scaled back in the end. Although there were some sort of quite strong building blocks. One of those was the identification and development of some financing and funding levers that government could pull to assist with projects. And this included UK export finance, which is now quite a large policy lever here in the UK for overseas projects, but also now domestic, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a while. And also the National Wealth Fund, which is very much based around domestic projects. Also, Climates was launched by UKRI, which is very much based around the rare earth element supply chain. And, you know, that's definitely been a huge success, and to my understanding, they're looking at sort of launching a second round of that, you know, because it certainly helped to push the TRL levels up of different of rare earth technologies here in the UK. So now we come to sort of the, I guess, sort of the current context. So government changes in summer of last year, and whilst this is going on, whilst sort of there's a bit of political change, British Geological Society British Geological Survey and CMEC are working on a revised criticality assessment to effectively update the list from 2022. So the list increases quite substantially to 34 minerals, which more closely mirrors the CRMA. And there's some interesting ones on there. So palladium is the only one that's dropped from the original list of 18. Iron is added, copper was not, which upset some people, as you can imagine. And there was no sort of strategic raw material classification as there is in the CRMA. So where, for example, in the CRMA you have sort of battery-grade nickel being an SRM, even though it didn't meet the criticality assessment, there were some calls for copper being added to a similar list. To my understanding, government is actually planning on introducing something to the tune of an SRM list as well. And if I recall, they were referring to them as a growth mineral list. So as an insight, we may see copper joining that list, potentially. So as we leave sort of autumn, winter 2024 and go into 2025, government's priority the whole way through the elections last year is to launch a formal industrial strategy. And this is something that they really want to do. It's a key thing. It's all about growth. It's all about identifying these key sectors. And there's an understanding that critical minerals sort of underpins all of them. So there's a quote here from the criticality assessment, which is really quite key. So bearing in mind, this is from last year. And it also highlights what is referred to as the IS8, which is sort of these growth-driving sectors. And in BGS and CMIX sort of criticality assessment, they quite rightly point out, look, you know, of those at IS8, the first four are effectively directly dependent on critical mineral supply, and the other four are indirectly dependent. So we're sort of getting closer to the kind of like the understanding that critical minerals are truly foundational to everything, basically. And just quickly, this is not the exhaustive list, but what I've done is compare UK, EU, USA, Canada, Australia to give an idea of some of the alignment, I suppose. And naturally, as we know, criticality assessments vary wherever they're conducted. But these are sort of roughly the 24, and then, you know, you can take rare earths as the lanthanide, so obviously a lot more. And there's a few sort of exceptions here. So the only one of these which isn't on the UK list is scandium, but I believe it falls under the lanthanides +2, so I think it is contained in the UK list on the rare earth elements. Tellurium isn't included on the EU list, but is on all the others, which is interesting. And graphite doesn't feature on the US list, but is on all the others, so just a rough comparison there. So as this is all going on, we get sort of into April 2025, and an independent report was commissioned for government, and Fraser Nash Consulting, in partnership with the CMA and the Materials Processing Institute, sort of looked more closely at the midstream and refining opportunity alongside recycling here in the UK, which had been previously identified as really sort of the key opportunity really as far as the wider supply chain goes. And these are some of the key priorities that were sort of that were outlined in that independent report. So on priority 3, for example, there was a sort of a system where companies could recover up to 30% of their energy costs if you're in an energy-intensive industry. And the reason that's important is because energy prices in the UK are extremely high, both you know, particularly for sort of commercial operators. And that's really a key barrier to growth across the supply chain here. So that's really quite an easy policy lever that government could potentially pull to improve the UK's competitiveness internationally. And then priority 7, for example, was really a call for government to detail the volumes of critical minerals due to be used in public infrastructure and defence, for example. So this was in April 2025, and we're sort of getting closer to present day. So then the big one is finally released in June 2025, the industrial strategy. And, you know, it kind of talks about critical minerals at a high level, not really in the granularity that I think a lot of people were expecting. And a lot of that, I think, is because there's kind of this ongoing, in all these policy documents, there's kind of like this ongoing feeling that, oh, the critical mineral strategy, when it's released, we'll discuss all of this in a bit more detail. So there's an understanding that critical minerals are foundational. There's a focus on the IS8, but it only really mentions critical minerals in sort of fleeting contexts. But what it does do is mention these critical mineral geographical clusters, which is quite key. And you know, some of these actually really only have 1 or 2 operations, but they really are quite strategic. So Fort William, for example, up here in Scotland and on the west coast, houses the only aluminium smelter left in the UK. It's an interesting project. It has its own hydropower. So Fort William features for that reason. South Wales, traditionally a massive centre of steel making, for example, but it also has Vale's nickel refinery, which is obviously a very important strategic asset for the UK. So it kind of mentions these critical mineral clusters and critical minerals in the same trail of thought as steel and chemicals and ceramics and all these other really sort of huge sort of buzzwords, which is good, you'd think. But then in the actual document of the ISA, it only actually really mentions critical minerals within the context of advanced manufacturing, which is obviously true, but as we know, it also underpins all of the others as well. So perhaps there's a sort of missing the point slightly to some extent. So it gets a mention under advanced manufacturing, and then one of the key sort of points for development is there's this idea that they're going to strengthen supply chains by supporting some of the foundational activities, and they're going to enhance the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre based at the British Geological Survey to do more in-depth sensitivity analyses and supply chain mapping and so on and so forth, which is good. So then if we kind of move on here, so yeah, this is the Advanced Manufacturing Plan. In the Advanced Manufacturing Plan, again, not that much mention of critical minerals. So really, we've got all these different kind of bits of policy. A lot of them are sort of formal reports, quite well put together, mention critical minerals, but really most of the mentions of critical minerals are that there is an upcoming critical mineral strategy, and the strategy will deal with these things, right? So there's still a bit of fragmentation. The critical mineral strategy initially was meant to be released in summer this year. It's something that the Department for Business and Trade, who lead on this, are still working on, and they're still actively engaging industry quite heavily on this. And you know, we're still not entirely sure on the timing, unfortunately. It could be the end of this month, it could be next month. We just don't know at the moment, I'm afraid. But really, this is what everyone's waiting for. Really, the idea is that this will enable a bit more of a targeted approach to what we do next, effectively, in terms of building supply chain resilience and seeing where the easy wins are, whether it be through policy levers or funding or whatever else. So there's a couple of reasons for the delay, as I mentioned. Industrial strategy, they wanted to wait for that to come out. It has come out. We had parliamentary recess here in the UK over summer, which usually takes 2 or 3 months, so that puts things on ice as well. So kind of hoping for it to come out soon. So now on to the more interesting bit, hopefully. So this page is pulled from an investment prospectus that the CMA has been putting together alongside UKRI and DBT. It's a non-exhaustive list of projects, I should mention, but it just kind of gives an idea, and you can kind of sort of see these clusters emerging a little bit more easily on a visual map, where you can kind of see where you've got these clusters of sort of critical minerals expertise, I guess. And really, you know, they're based all across the supply chain. So you've got primary extractive projects here, mines, processors and refiners, recycling, and you know, there are many that aren't on here as well, in fairness. So if you're interested in seeing more, on the Critical Mineral Intelligence Centre, they have an interactive map that also includes gold and silver refiners and things like that, which gives probably a slightly better idea. But a key thing here is that a lot of the OEMs and end users are often situated near some of these clusters, so it's you know, increases the competitiveness of the projects, you'd think. Just briefly on Scotland, seeing as we're in Scotland, I felt like I should just quickly talk about Scotland. So with the way devolved power works here in the UK, they do have some control over planning and permitting processes, which is a key barrier to growth here, like, you know, countrywide. So you have the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, which is effectively its own version of the EA, so they can expedite processes if they want to. In a national sort of UK context, they have less say, I suppose, over national strategy. But there's a lot of strong background here in oil and gas and chemicals, heavy industry, shipbuilding, so on and so forth. A lot of transferable skills, highly competent labour force. Renewables, offshore wind, extremely strong here. Only aluminium smelter left in the UK. And there's a real sort of circular economy aspect of this as well, where, you know, there's going to be a lot of end-of-life material entering the market, particularly from the wind sector in, say, 10 years' time. So really building out those capabilities here in Scotland would be the logical thing to do, and I think is something which is gaining traction. In the UK more generally for these critical mineral projects, I mean, you know, there are quite a few different sort of funding opportunities and levers that you can pull. One criticism that comes up quite a lot is there aren't actually that many mid-ticket sort of funding opportunities. So what you find is there's a lot of good R&D sort of funding opportunities at the lower level, and then you have the higher level through UKEF and the National Wealth Fund, which are typically very large ticket investments, sort of over £50 million and up. And there's sort of a bit of a call to kind of retool some of these funding mechanisms to support projects that are either lower capex or lower scale, particularly in the critical raw materials sort of circular economy context, to really try and support some of those projects to hit that TRL 9, really, to hit that sweet spot, survive the valley of death, and so on and so forth. So some of these barriers to growth here that have been identified are these are largely circular economy based, although a lot of them are transferable to the upstream projects as well as the mining projects. So really, a lot of it's quite similar, I think, to what we see in the European Union and in other sort of peer and partner nations. So a lot of it is around waste classification. OPEX is high in the UK. A lot of it is power-based, as I was mentioning. And, offtake is a problem for everyone, really. And in terms of the private sort of finance space, scale-up financing can be a little bit challenging to secure. Feedstock's always an issue. Lack of design for recycling and standards for products, as we know, it's a big thing. It features pretty prominently in the CRMA, particularly within the context of rare earth magnetic materials. And planning and permitting is a notable issue here in the UK, and it's something which, to my understanding, government is doing quite a lot of work on at the moment in trying to create sort of a one-stop shop sort of entity, which will be able to assist projects which are deemed to be of some sort of national importance, to effectively expedite those processes. So, in terms of where the UK opportunity lies, I guess, there's a long history of upstream in this country from the mining context. Very large automotive and aerospace, defence sectors. Renewables are strong here as well, particularly in the wind context. And there are a lot of transferable skills from sort of other sectors as well. So really, these are some of the key opportunities that have been identified, or at least the angles which the nation should actively pursue. And, alignment with peer nations is quite key on this as well. So in terms of what we can expect for the future, and this sort of brings me to the end of my policy rant, by the way. Really, I think what we can expect to see from the consultations that have been held with UK government over the last year or so are that we can probably expect to see quite broad alignment with the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union. And a lot of this is a part of the policy shift and policy reset from the current government when they came into office last summer, with the whole sort of UK-EU reset of relations idea. And, equally, there'll probably going to be quite a lot of regulatory alignment on CSRD, particularly where responsible sourcing and sustainability disclosures are concerned. But aside from alignment, this fits into the bigger picture of sort of consolidation of standards, for example, which is something that, the UK should seek to take an active role on promoting, I think, alongside the EU and other partners. What we're also likely to see is more targeted international partnerships, not just with the EU, but also bilaterally and multilaterally. So in the critical minerals context, the MSP continues to be a thing, Mineral Security Partnership, although it's sort of on hold at the moment because of the administration change in the US. G7 and Commonwealth are quite actively participating and working in the critical mineral space at the moment as well. And also the UK, I know, government is speaking sort of bilaterally with a few select nations of interest, such as Canada, Australia, India, on where the opportunities may lie in collaborating in critical mineral supply chains. There's also been some signposting in some of the policy documentation I briefly spoke about before, such as the industrial strategy. So there may be a further broadening of some of the funding packages available at the moment to sort of cover other nodes in the supply chain and make funding available where it wasn't before. We have no detail on what that's going to look like, unfortunately. It's effectively two-liners and policy documents which suggest that, they are actively looking at these things, which is, good. And quite crucially, the critical mineral strategy, when it does come out, is also going to feature quite heavily in a vice versa sort of context with the forthcoming circular economy strategy, which is being developed by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, known as DEFRA here in the UK. And the idea really is to drive reform, promote recycling and retain critical minerals within the UK economy. And, we see similar kind of policy rhetoric in the EU, for example, around the retention of end-of-life material. Naturally, all of this comes with reforms around waste classification and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated picture. Sorry for boring you with the policy side of things, but hopefully it gives some insights into where UK government thinking is going and where industry is likely to follow over sort of the coming year or two. And I think the key takeaway is we can expect to see some quite broad alignment with European Union policy as part of that wider relationship reset. And I would just add, generally speaking, all across industry in the critical mineral supply chain here in the UK, that alignment already exists anyway, in the sense that anything which is all the forthcoming sort of regulatory bits and pieces from the European Union, for example, are already being adhered to, you know, labelling and so on and so forth. Active participation on ISO and CEN panels to sort of really promote these kind of things is all happening already. So we can expect to see a lot of alignment, and hopefully that's good for all of us, good for the UK, good for EU. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from all of you later on. Thanks.
Thank you. There would be a round table, of course, but maybe if there is one question, maybe we can still take it.
Sure, if anybody has any burning questions, please feel free.
Any clarification?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Your key points, there was a sentence developing of contact point or point of contact.
Yes.
Can you develop it a little bit? Because I didn't get
I'll
it in a single point of contact.
Yeah.
Shop.
Yeah, good question. So I'm happy to speak about that. So I mean, if we kind of look at the parallel with the European Union, right, we have the timing limits effectively for the strategic projects, for example, both for the domestic mining, but also refining and processing permitting times. I think I forget which way round it is. I think maybe extraction is 27 months, Ludivine, correct me, and I think processing is 15. And UK government have seen this, and they're saying, okay, well, this is good because industry is always talking about planning and permitting being a real key barrier. Some projects literally die in the process of waiting for planning and permitting, and it happens in all over Europe, right? So there's a real key impetus to kind of set up some sort of, I'm not sure if it's going to be an agency, because there hasn't been any light sort of shed on what it's going to look like in practice, but it could be an agency, or it could be an arm of what already exists in the Environment Agency here in the UK, which is typically who deal with planning and permitting. And the idea really is to collate some of that expertise into one place, which then enables the expedited sort of planning and permitting processes to take place. And another key thing, which maybe I should mention, is it's notoriously bad across the board in the UK, planning and permitting, with the exception of sort of chemical parks and special economic zones, which are typically in free ports. So it's not that it can't be done, it can. And it's very well known to be very efficient within certain contexts, but specifically within the wider industry context, and in our case, within critical minerals, it's a laborious process. So government are aware of it, and they are engaging industry at the moment, and I think thinking internally about how they can help expedite planning and permitting. Yeah.
I think that's true for all other countries, not only for the UK.
I think everybody's sort of chasing the same. I think a lot of the issues here in the UK, or the barriers, let's say, to growth, are very much transferable to a lot of the European Union and also elsewhere. We're sort of struggling with the same things, but we don't have that sort of centralised policy document yet, which really directly signposts, or at least in theory, signposts what's next. And as we know, the CRMA isn't perfect, but it does a lot to sort of step in the right direction in terms of outlining and being ambitious, effectively. And that's something that we're currently working towards here, so hopefully we'll see it soon. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Enzo, again. Yes, we will have the more detailed discussion later. Now I would like to have Ludivine as second speaker. And let me open the file.
It's Enzo talking about the EU because he's more optimistic than I am.
And then next time I will use the microphone for the questions because it's probably better for the recording. But anyway, this should be okay for you. Thanks, Ludivine. The floor is yours.
Okay. So in true commission style, I'm kidding, I'm not a commission officer, but I have 47 slides for 2.5 hours of discussion. I'm joking. Okay, so, sorry. All right. So, frankly, what I wanted to discuss with you today is three things. So this slide is voluntarily anxiety-inducing, but what I was trying to do is help us to remember that we may have like step one of the entire minerals conversation. There should be like 20 more of these slides later. I can make them available easily. And also at the back of this presentation, there's a whole recap on how the CRMA came about and the content and all that if you're really interested. So what I'm hoping to discuss with you today is, first of all, we're a year out from the CRMA. We need to understand when it was adopted and why it's at the moment delivered no outcomes. The second thing I'd like to discuss is what are the pillars or elements that we can build the next steps on and why they are slightly more purposeful and useful than what we had with the CRMA to start with. And then I guess the last point I'd like to discuss, per Bruno's request, is what I see as the make or break moments or points that are coming our way and what that could mean for the minerals agenda for the EU. So again, incredibly busy slide. The idea was to remind us all that the CRM Act was adopted in the very last minutes of the first von der Leyen Commission. What that means is that it was an end of policy cycle piece of regulation. It was late. This policy initiative should have happened a couple of years before. And its delay means that it was adopted with really the last dregs of political capital that were available to place on this issue. So the CRMA, okay, it's a first step. It has some targets, interesting regulation. It makes a bunch of promises about expedited timelines. In French, we say that these are the promises that only bind the fools who believe them. So let's all take it as what it is, which is a strong statement of ambition from a end of policy cycle commission, okay? A couple of implications to the future. The first one is that all of the implementation of the CRMA is coordination actions. Why? Because it was adopted without a specific budget. Anything that the EU adopt that doesn't have a built-in budget will rely solely on coordination, bringing people around the table, fostering collaborative action by the member states, or using core EU competencies that don't depend on the member states. There's only two, trade and competition. These are the pillars of EU policy where the EU has an exclusive mandate. It decides on its own, and it imposes on the member states what is going to be, the law of the day. Trade, of course, it's a little bit more subtle because, as you can see from the EU-US deal, whatever the Commission agrees then has to still be negotiated at the Parliament and Council level. But the reality is those are the two exclusive competencies. So why am I mentioning that? Because we are dealing with a CRM Act that is mostly a legacy kind of approach, okay? In the year since the CRM Act was adopted, two things have happened. First of all, we had a major political transition. It doesn't show because von der Leyen is still the president of the Commission, but underneath, the entire mandate of the EU has been in renegotiation. The EU has gone from an over-focused mandate on climate and transition action to having to balance that with very real, very concrete, and frankly, increasing economic and regional security concerns. War is literally on our doorstep, and last week it was inside our borders in Poland. So the EU is, quite frankly, getting a major reality check, okay? Second thing that happened is that the EU has finally acknowledged that although it calls itself a major market, it simply is not. The EU is not a lead market for minerals. It is not a premium market. It is not a major innovator. The EU is a market that simply does not, at the moment, have the capacity to shift market forces in favor of its strategic autonomy ambitions. Harsh thing to say, but the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging it exists. So the EU has finally acknowledged that it is not currently favored by market forces in minerals. So what we've seen is a narrative that's gone from the market is failing, which is incorrect. The market is working well, it's just not working for us, to a situation where we understand we now need to redesign markets. This is why I insisted on this question of competition policy, because the whole point of competition policy is to design markets. So we're shifting from a let's try and have industrial policy on the back of the energy crisis in Ukraine to let's rebuild markets. And that is a significant shift in how the EU is approaching things. The second thing is that, as I said, the geostrategic tensions are increasing, and they're on all fronts. The EU-US deal is by no means done. It will remain a key point of contention. And let's be honest, if any of you are nerdy enough to have watched the State of the European Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen in Parliament this week, you will have realized that there is, at the moment, a real feeling of, how can I say, of inadequacy of our tools. So again, the EU has always had a narrative that we're a big market, therefore people care about us. Yeah, the fact is, at the moment, competitive advantage comes from forward-looking industrial policy and investment. The EU has had none of these for decades. So there's an acknowledgement that in the geostrategic context, our tools need to be completely updated, okay? As to the green shoots, and I can go into the details of all these links if you like. It's really not that fun, but I'm sure you can have fun with that. The green shoots all come from one statement of ambition. You've all heard about the Draghi report. What's relevant in the Draghi report is the fact that it says very explicitly, we either reform or we die. We do this together or not at all. What you have had since is what's been called Draghi on a shoestring, the competitiveness agenda, the competitiveness compass, which was adopted in January at the beginning of the new policy cycle, after the new commission was put in place in December, is supposed to be the big roadmap for the next 5 years. The difficulty is that at the moment, the commission doesn't have the capacity to impose a lot of that agenda. So we're still dealing with member states who are pulling and pushing in all the wrong directions and who are competing amongst themselves. Germany carries out its own separate conversations with Canada to reorganize supplies of certain minerals. Simultaneously, German industry is causing a major problem for the European minerals industry because they keep buying nickel from Russia and most of their components and highly processed minerals from China. So what we have are a lack of vision, a lack of clarity, and frankly, still a very complex set of priorities. If you have too many priorities, you have none at all. So at this point, we need to look at these tools. The key tools are, of course, the political guidelines, which are the commitment that the Commission makes to Parliament, the competitiveness compass, which is the roadmap for the next 5 years. As actors in the sector, we now need to go take these statements of ambition and pull the Commission towards actual implementation. That is still very much in progress, okay? This is my own personal view of the situation. I've had this kind of, four-quarter perspective since the CRMA was adopted. It is evolving. I think if we look at the green shoots, as I said, there's 3 key points. The first one is the main actors in European policy, the people who have institutional capacity as well as exclusive mandates, DG Competition, DG Trade, are now active in the minerals agenda. They were not a year ago. DG Competition is currently speaking to European industry about how they procure, recycle, and use minerals. This is the beginning of a conversation where European industry basically rethinks how it positions together. Instead of talking about a big market, we have the possibility of starting to act like a big market. DG Trade has now integrated all of the raw materials diplomacy space. You have the rise of new instruments, but more importantly, minerals now feature in all free trade agreements. We still have several steps to go because the reality is what is at the heart of the minerals agenda for Europeans and others, and I'm looking at Chris because I know he's coming right after me, is the trilemma of investments and markets. It's impossible to structure large-scale investment into mining and minerals to redesign value chains because currently it's impossible to be certain that there is an offtake market for a variety of products because these markets are controlled by systemic rivals, China in particular. Therefore, we need to solve both of those equations together. So beyond trade, we're going to have to talk about investment promotion and therefore investment protection. This comes back to the question of what is your priority? If our priorities remain to engage in raw materials diplomacy with blah, blah language about win-win partnerships, and we don't have the hard conversations on investment protection, we continue to waste time. Europeans are starting to realize we're out of time, absolutely out of time. And last but not least, because I see I've already spoken way too long, this, for me, as I was saying, are the two pillars of the issue, investment and shaping markets. I left the green dot in the middle because I wanted to show you that I made a good faith attempt to find a space where we have progressed enough to use a green dot, and I didn't. But the reason I want to put that up there is that I think there's like 3 key issues or problems that we have to address collectively as actors in innovation, as actors in mineral value chains, and fundamentally as policy influencers. The first one is understanding and getting through to policy shapers the fact that minerals are integral to everything else. So the notion of interconnected dynamic systems is at the heart of the Draghi report, and it's very difficult to integrate for policy shapers who like to have neat little boxes where they can say, this is minerals, this is industry, this is healthcare, this is trade. Everything works together. So accepting the dynamic and complex nature of these systems and dealing in that systemic approach is something that we need to embrace, we need to share with policy, and collectively, we all need to also recognize what are the limitations we create in that system and in that complexity. We got very lucky because the first 6 months of 2025, I can go back to my first slide if you want. The first 6 months, the presidency, political presidency of the EU Council, i.e. the presidency amongst member states, which Poland. Poland made a real effort to understand that and to set an agenda to reset the minerals approach in the EU. They came out with 6 key recommendations, happy to share them with you. The fact is, transversal to everything is a systemic approach. So member states, particularly some of the industrial leaders, are getting this. The second thing that we need to absolutely deal with is the fact that you can't balance these 2 pillars if you don't know what you're shooting for. Priorities, priorities, priorities. Let's not kid ourselves. The entire market has been factoring in the fact that defense demand is on the rise. But what is defense demand? How does it integrate into the whole transition and climate impact and climate action narratives that we've had? How is it going to shape markets? At the moment, we need to make hard choices in the EU on mobility, on industrialization, on defense and responsible sourcing for defense. Those choices are going to shift how we impact mineral markets, and we need to make choices. Again, State of the European Union speech, there were like 17 priorities listed. I know that doesn't work because my to-do list is 17 points and I don't get any of them done. Imagine when you've got 27 people at the table. So priorities, 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 and I think that is where we are today. I think we are looking at 6 to 12 months of very hard choices in the EU. Unfortunately, in a context where Germany's in flux, France is on the verge of whatever. The UK, thank goodness, is our friend again, but also facing its own internal turmoil. Poland just had very difficult and, frankly, in the end, unhappy election results for the European project. We've got elections coming in several other European countries. The coordination that's needed is not supported by the political landscape, okay? And last but not least, and I'll shut up about this, the reason that priorities are important is that policy shapers need to show the way. We keep talking about social acceptance. Social acceptance does not suddenly appear in the clouds like a miracle and come down and spread across communities and, affected groups. Social acceptance is built. Somebody will have to put the political capital on the table necessary to build that kind of shared vision. At the moment, we're not doing that. If we set our priorities right and political capital is invested in minerals as much as financial capital, we stand a chance to have honest conversations. At the moment, social acceptance is still deemed to be a very local problem. It's not. It's a systemic issue. So all three of those we need to address together, and that, for me, are the three conversations we're having in the next 6 to 12 months. Ça va?
Thank you, Ludivine. Is there maybe one question for Ludivine before we move to the next speaker? Well,
no.
That's there, Thomas.
Thank you very much for that. It was a fascinating interpretation of the current state of affairs. I have a question for you on something you mentioned around offtake, stimulating offtake. What do you think will be the most efficient strategy to stimulate offtake? Because everything in supply chain stems from that. So what do you think the best route to make that offtake mandated or whatever? What do you think the best way to do that is?
So there's the mechanics of it, and then there's the vision behind the mechanics. So far, we've had a lot of demand aggregation proposals or initiatives driven by DG Grow, but all based on the mistaken notion that European industry is on board with the agenda. So for me, there's two aspects. The first one is you can't aggregate demand, you can't structure a market if there is not a clear move by the private sector in that direction. So again, comes back to priorities. Are we going to have politicians who say to industry, I understand your predicament. You're selling EVs that are too expensive and totally unsuited to your market. Oops, wrong choice. You're still going to have to buy from standards-based market using the G7 initiative. You're still going to have to comply with sourcing priorities, mandates. Perhaps we incentivize this, but fundamentally, until and unless somebody actually has a conversation with industry where we accept the fact that we are no longer in a world where buying nickel from Russia is okay, then I'm not quite sure how we get there. And then the mechanics of it. Frankly, one of the recommendations that was made by the Polish presidency is the fact that if we're going to act as a market, we need a market maker. We need a market structurer. The idea of a European agency, again, modeled on exclusive competence, not something where you coordinate and you do a CRM board and some vague demand aggregation platform that nobody cares about. No, full-blown agency. JOGMEC is often cited as an example, but this is where competition law comes in. The success of JOGMEC is not that JOGMEC is better than any of us. The success is that JOGMEC is at the heart of a very efficient cartel of Japanese buyers. If we're going to be reforming cartels, then we need to reshape our competition law, bring industry to the table, agree on sourcing priorities that we're going to actually run with. Not all talk about lithium because the commission's hot on lithium. You know, we need to do a lot of work ourselves as the private sector. And then, yeah, maybe an agency is the best way to do it. Very, very hopeful thinking on my part.
So we close on a bright end. Thanks, Ludivine. And now we move to our friends from beyond the Atlantic. Christopher came here from the US, and of course he also knows about the EU, but that's going to be his view from the other side of the ocean, and that have been news in the last months. So there you are.
Excellent.
Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And no, Ludivine and I did not coordinate our talks, but appreciate this opportunity to talk about the current situation in U.S. critical minerals policy. We have lots of aspirations, not necessarily well tuned to market realities, and I think there are some, I don't want to call them concerns, but there's some potential that the U.S. could do some market warping. This is a very macro level look, which I think a lot of times we're all in our industries and we like to look at the little bits and pieces, but there's a lot of externalities that really drive decisions. So why now for the United States? When I finished my university education in minerals, there wasn't a functional minerals industry in the U.S. at that point. But the reality is, we had the Cold War ending. The U.S. had a pretty internalized focus on how it was going to maintain its supply chains. And then globalization sort of came through, and then COVID-19 made them realize that was just too fragile from basically what the core values of the political system were. At the end of the day, national security, always plays into every component of the U.S., but also the domestic growth and employment being really critical. And one of the key things is with that supply chain disruption, they started recognizing that our raw material flows were a problem, even with the sloughing off of a lot of industry. But the interesting part is it's a bipartisan component. The Democrats and the Republicans actually support it. They might have difference in details, but fundamentally this is actually a very major policy space in the United States. 4 of the first 6 executive orders by Donald Trump were actually related to minerals. Got a lot of people excited, devil's in the details though. And part of this, obviously, we've got a lot of geopolitical dependence on China, whether it's in the refining or final manufacturing or foundries or you name it, within the system for the United States, just like it is for the EU. But the U.S. historically, they like to have a competitor. They always want that foil to build policy against that has now evolved very strongly to being China. So this creates an interesting component. We're not in the days of acquiring titanium from the Soviet Union, calling it, for pizza ovens. And so, there's this new dynamic going on. And of course, the Ukraine war and the interesting trade policies that we have instituted have created a lot more disruption and uncertainty, which can create opportunities, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the way I want to do is approach this. So Intra last year went through a process developing these scenarios and these 4 end-member scenarios that look at the political, economic, social, technological dynamics. Again, it's focused on how the externalities will shape or can shape the raw materials world of 2050. And it's finding it actually be a very useful tool in this kind of disrupted environment. And so this will be sort of the lens I'll approach. And I've become a real fan of these scenario techniques and working with the National Academies of Science in the US, looking at how we can take the same approach to look at the vertical workforce in the mineral sector in the United States, which is a complete disaster. It's completely disorganized. Because really, in this case, we used the pestle framework and leveraged it to bring in experts from the US and the EU in the raw material section to really harness the collective wisdom. And I think that's one of those key functions, because as we laid out sort of these 20 main factors that can influence mining, we let them go run wild to say, hey, these are the actions and reactions that are within the system that maybe you haven't thought about. And at the end of the day, we had this crazy spreadsheet, couple thousand by couple thousand factors that then we had to cross coordinate. So every action had a reaction. Was it negative or was it positive? What were the strengths? So it creates a very interesting political economic model. And so these were some of the top level factors, just to give you a sense for the diversity and spread. But then there were multiple layers of these very specific actions, reactions that were taken into consideration. And just I'll skip through these real quick. So there were 4 what we called in the end member scenarios. So these were the extremes. No expectation for it to be the current situation. And this was actually just derived, so we were working with Fraunhofer, who has a modeling system that was actually able to extract these as clusters from all of the input from the experts. And so the one we had sort of the most positive is this great transition. This is actually about global common goals and cooperation. And one of the outcomes, which was interesting, is as you work through with that, you had price stabilization in the mineral sector. And also this worldview of mining is actually part of the solution because it's driving economic well-being. It's sort of this, I think exactly what Ludivine said is, the social acceptance actually has to occur up here. And that's sort of what these models or these scenarios kept pulling back out. The other was this advancement wave. We had global trade blocks, but the blocks in the end were all actually going for the same goals, but there was sort of this friendly competition. It did actually increase price instability, and we saw labor shortages. As everyone here is pretty much coming from a technical background, there are not enough of us in the world, and as soon as you put barriers up, things don't work well on the labor front. And a lot of my work is in labor economics, so it's a personal pet peeve of mine. Interestingly, though, mining was considered a positive player. So basically, we're still at a somewhat above even view, positive view. So now, as we move into the more negative areas, the divided domains. This is where you have these global trade blocks driven by sort of strong powers, increase in nationalism. Starting to sound sort of common here. But one of the things, these barriers really do start to curtail the progress in supply chain development, leading to increased price instability. And now the perspective on mining becomes more negative because it becomes a factor of instability in the global scheme. And I'd say this is probably where we've been for we're historically for a long time. And then sort of the most negative, what we call this downward spiral, as you really get into national self-interest, and balkanization of trade, you do now lead into complete breakdown in some of the supply chains. And one of the factors that came out is not even economic, but it's an economic regression. In fact, in the sense that the economic policies and approaches move back, it's like we unlearn. And I think this is one of the key things because there was also a sense that you see that in the industry too. The industry unlearned some of the things that it had done. When it gets into these very small competitive components. And so this obviously is a very challenging place to be within the scenarios. So we'll play out through what's been happening in the U.S. and U.S. has gone through a lot of policy shocks in so far this year, and that's actually by intent by this administration. Shake things up. You can love it or hate it. It just is the realities. And one of the most interesting things, if you didn't notice, the USGS put out its proposed list of critical minerals for 2025. It's 58. They track 79. We're getting to the point where, and I don't disagree with this at all minerals are critical. It is a very integrated material system. They're starting to actually look, hey, we got foundry issues, we got all these other components. The system doesn't work if we just simply are only focused on a couple. Now, whether or not the non-criticality is because of availability, that's their debate. not get into it. But it is a trend, and it's interesting to see. The other thing that happened in the big, beautiful bill is that the Defense Department has basically been given about $7 billion to do as they wish for investments in the mineral sector. Anywhere in the world, anything they want to do. Defense Department's also very good at getting supplemental funding. So consider this a floor for money that they can invest. And we've already seen it. They dropped $400 million into MP Minerals to build a heavy rare earth magnet processing facility. They've actually bought a couple mining companies. They bought properties overseas. They're doing pre-purchases. They are very active. So now you suddenly have a different player out there just in the Defense Department. That doesn't even include the money going to Department of Energy and some of the other areas. So some very interesting changes there. Because what that fundamentally means is they're nationalizing a lot of the companies. You know, the U.S. government is becoming a mining company or a mining conglomerate, and it's an interesting place for us to be. Traditionally, it's always just like the EU, tweaking the knobs, making the industry respond in different ways. This is a much more direct intervention implementation of policy. It's a trend. We'll see how far it goes, but it is interesting. The isolationism is being applied across all policy actions. We'll talk about one of the real implications here on technical labor in a minute. But the other thing that's interesting is the budgetary rescissions that were immediately implemented by the Trump administration actually hit the core infrastructure, education, and labor markets immediately. So it sort of took the knees out from underneath a lot of the activities of the minerals. So there's all this aspiration. We want to do all this new mineral development, but basically the core which it's built on was immediately weakened. And so what we see is a real challenge in the policy space that there isn't necessarily full recognition of market realities at the top level of the policy space, because I think the frustration is we have a lot of folks in the mid-level in the U.S. policy space that really are very good on minerals. They get it. They know what's happening. The likely, well, he'll be confirmed probably in the next week or two. New director of the U.S. Geological Survey, absolutely. I mean, he knows this whole system inside and out. He understands all the realities. So there's that talent, but the top-level reactionary policies are based on a 2 to 4 year election cycle, and they want to see those changes. So how do we can hope that the knowledge actually can float up as we move through? So the problem is they don't really understand the mineral development dynamics, the duration, the decadal timescales we're looking at, the time for things like social license and the like to play out. And they're also not necessarily recognizing the fact that mineral prospects have a pretty modest return. Historically in the U.S., it's about a 4% return. That's right where our interest rates are. So in a lot of cases, and this has been historically for a long time, I make more money keeping minerals in the ground in the U.S. than investing in it. And now we have the bigger problem is what we don't know is the administration would like to force the Fed to drop interest rates at the banks, but we have a debt problem getting harder and harder to service. Our T-bills are now over 5%. It's now not only is it going to be cheaper for me to live in minerals, it's going to be cheaper for me to go to a bank that's been told I can only charge 1%, take money out and just go put it in government securities. So the capital market, getting access to unfreeze the capital markets into minerals is actually a tough call. And so I think this is one of the reasons that we're seeing more direct intervention by the government. They realize that this is a really, we have a material need, but this is a case where the finance market is really struggling. The other side, we have workforce crisis. We have far too few geoscientists, far too few miners. We just don't have really any metallurgists in the US, and trade workers. So this is a huge problem. They can aspire, but we don't actually have the capacity, physical human capacity to do this right now. So it really does bring in this question, though, because of some of these mismatches, is the U.S. becoming a state player? So we do have this policy imperative. We need mineral access, and we want it now, because we're on a 2-year, 4-year policy cycle. We need to show return. And the actions they're doing is showing immediate return. But the problem is it there for the long term? Is it sustainable? Because we really have sort of ended our friends and families approach that we've done since the end of World War II, which really was a big, long play strategy. Keep the U.S. minerals in the ground in the U.S. That becomes our strategic reserve. Let's take everyone else's minerals. So now we're focused on extracting domestically as best as we can or having full control. We now also have taxpayer capital going directly into minerals. This is a new play for us. Before it was sort of indirect through tax credits and other incentives. Now, heck, we're just spending the money. So that's a really big difference. And we're unrolling regulations. And I think this is the one that I have very mixed feelings about, just as the administration has sort of said, you know, this whole seabed mining thing, we don't really care what the international regulations say. This is a big issue. You know, what are they going to say about the Antarctic? What are they going to do in, you know, on international waters? And so it's not just environmental regulations, it's some of this bigger picture strategic. And so that is acting more like a state player, which in my experience working a lot in the energy sector, it's acting a lot more like a national oil company. So there are lessons to take in the energy markets to apply into the minerals market, because we're also converging sort of on the China model. We may have companies, but those companies are doing a national policy bidding. Good, bad, or different, I'm not passing a judgment, but it is a behavior. And I think this is a potential disadvantage for the European Union, because they're still working on cooperative strategies, just as the US had for a long time. Now you're fighting in a world with a lot of sharp elbows. And I think that's one of the key concerns or warnings, you know, from a European perspective. So back to these scenarios, what's interesting is if we take the scenarios, you know, most positive in the upper left, most negative in bottom right, and we sort of, what's happened this year? What I find interesting is, and this is how you can flow through in these kinds of responses. So end of the Biden administration, we were probably somewhere between the Great Transition Advancement wave. We were spending a lot on that core technology advancements. Trump comes in, he just starts cutting stuff, but what's interesting is he cut the core infrastructure first. Not all the advanced work going into electrification. So temporarily, we actually saw that whole system sort of shift more down into the Great Transition. Now, he's more than made up for that time in the interim, but basically, in these complex systems, these policy components can take you into unknown territories, which if they happen to stick well, can be positive. But in this case, then we moved into the trade disruptions. That really started fracturing, you know, for the U.S., our ability to acquire materials, you know, for our industries. But I think the really big one for us was here just a week or two ago when, you know, Russia, India, and China got together. You know, if you take that and then you take the move by OPEC plus, economic war has been declared on the United States. Full stop. They're just going to go straight at the jugular of our resource economies. And that's where we are right now. And where does it go? That's what I think is interesting in the scenarios. The logical momentum says into a dark place. But the scenarios actually have, we can play out a whole bunch of different responses and what those cause effects are to actually try to predict forward what this kind of situation might look like. And that's where I find the utility of these scenarios. And there's 5 or 6 groups out there that have done very similar kinds of approaches. And I think these are great tools, because it does bring in the question, could be negative, doesn't have to be. We'll have to see how it plays out. So the implications, though, U.S., we're on the verge of potentially overreach in our policy approaches that could create a systemic failure, because we're not investing in the entire chain for the long term. We're going for the quick win. The EU, you're going to be facing a much more state-focused U.S. posture, sharp elbows. You know, so I think that is a challenge, very much, I think, like Ludivine was talking about. For industry, you know, obviously, you know, from the U.S. perspective, product delivery and capital markets become very, very complex. And now we're adding additional state competitors. That's always a big change, and obviously the interest rate issues are pretty uncertain. However, you know, well-played chaos can be very profitable, especially in the resource sector. And I think there are going to be serious winners in this entire process for, you know, for folks in the industry, whether it's traditional players or some of the emerging folks as well. And so I think, you know, seeing through to the ahead, what's really here. You know, we've got these scenarios. You know, the economic models that they, and social economic models that they develop, it does show how the opportunities, if they align policy with reality, really can be predictable, be concrete, and lead you into a predictable space. But that the areas where it kept, every scenario it kept falling down are the risks if we ignore the timeframes, the economics, really the financing component, and the people component. Those were the Achilles heel that we kept running into. And so, these scenarios help identify these next options related to the U.S. Mineral policy. The big one is we're investing today in American football. We would call this a Vince Lombardi moment. We're spending all the money today to win today. Tomorrow will take care of tomorrow. That's a really bad situation to be in such a capital-intensive industry, but that seems to be where we're at. But the U.S. is moving very, very quickly and changing its posture, so it does actually have the risk of warping the market because it's changing the rules of how it plays. And I'm not sure the industry players that aren't part of that club are ready, or other groups like the EU or whatever. And so it's moving very quickly, and it's going to be interesting to see how folks respond. But again, just back to the scenarios, in this unstable world, we need to predict ahead the multiple futures and what those options look like and how maybe we respond. And I think we've been too reactionary. And I think within the mineral sector, we've always been too reactionary. And so I think there are a lot of good tools out there for us. So leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Just the usual question, if we have time. Yeah, Christian.
It's not really a question, but a comment, because in the past I was aware that usually the Republicans saw the devil of communism in the Democrats, and now they are doing it themselves. So it's they are making self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever. Yeah. But it's more a comment, so you cannot answer because, as you mentioned. But the question is, do you see really a capability of a well-managed chaos in your society or in the companies?
Yes, there is the possibility. I mean, we're working with a couple groups. There are a lot of groups that are like going, time out, slow down, let's do this right. We actually have the political will and capital. But the impatience at the top, if we can slow it down, bring it to the folks that really know what's going on, then I think we can see a bigger transition. Right now, it's just a very short-term view. If we get some of those successes, this is where I have some optimism. Some successes in, like Mountain Pass, for instance. So if you start seeing the onshoring of not just the light rare earths, but also the heavy, that will be considered a big win. People will they'll be willing to take the longer investments. So I think the optimism is if we get a couple of these wins, we maybe can get the rest of the system to then gel. But it's to be seen.
Chris, excellent presentation. I have one maybe comment or question. Not that I'm supporting the approach, but don't you think that Trump has gone the same way as China has been doing for several, sort of state capitalism, to try to overarch or have an influence on what's happening in the States, similar as China has on its own resources?
Yeah, and I think, yes, and I think it's intentional because the view has been that the minerals issue is critical for the economy. As a student history, they dusted off the playbook from the Cold War. That's what they did. They're just doing it in a very overt way that we can actually match to China versus more directed investments, in building up stockpiles and things like that. So it's an old playbook played in a new world, I think, in a lot of ways. But yes, it's a very direct intervention.
Can I ask one last question? One more? Sorry. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris. So my question is, you mentioned the fact that we are emulating what we did in oil and gas, and the rise of national ownership, the policy alignment. If we unpack that and we compare oil and gas profitability to ours, oil and gas's capacity to align on market design and our structural incapacity to, as an industry, I'm not quite sure I see where this approach is going. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
The problem is oil and gas goes, the petroleum goes into a refinery and gets fractionated out and the products all come out. And then you're just, one step and you're largely done from that standpoint. That's where I think the challenge is here, is that you have very diverse, material flows coming out from that. I don't think that's been thought out. Because I think what we have is, I'll say, the sort of the minor 49er mentality. Hey, get it out of the ground, and then whatever, someone's going to deal with it. And so, and that's where most of the folks in this place are like waving their arms. We don't have the midstream in place at all. We don't have the talent, even if we had the capital and the infrastructure. And so that's where we need to. I'm hoping for some wins to get them to slow down, so to build up that midstream. But I think in the current point, from an exploration and acquisition standpoint, it's very much a knock approach, but the downstream is too immature to take that on, and I think that's one of the challenges.
Right, so we will have a shorter coffee maybe. But now we close this part of the workshop with Nabeel Mancheri from EIT Raw Materials, and we have already mentioned the rare earths. I think you will be talking more about that. Where is the mouse? It disappeared. Yeah. Right. Should be here. So we dive into a specific topic, but we have time.
Thanks. Thanks, Bruno, and thanks for giving me this opportunity, and thanks for EPMA, RESQTOOL, and Bloom. And so we started good that our previous speakers set the ground, speaking generally largely on the critical raw material sector, and focusing on the UK, continental Europe, then to US. So now I would rather be a bit specifically a specific sector. Previous speakers mentioned rare earths, and specifically on magnets, and it's also a strategic project in the strategic sector in terms of, especially from the perspective of EU. And I'm Nabeel Mancheri, as mentioned. I'm a senior advisor at the EIT Raw Materials. I'll start with what EIT Raw Materials is one of the largest private, public, and an innovation community focusing on EU. We are several sub-regional officers and workforce. Specifically started as building an EU critical raw material value chain. So we largely a kind of a funding organization of the EU. But last couple of years we also has been expanding our focus on investing in equity or facilitating the shareholding and private players, etc. So we have a number of calls that specifically like the Horizon projects like here. We also have project calls, but largely we focus on the kind of TRL level, upper level of the TRL level, but also what has been left behind these projects. So it's an opportunity. Once these, there have been billions of funds for this kind of Horizon projects, then you finish that project, then there are, products and services at various labs of the EU universities and research institute. So we specifically look at those projects and see if we can commercialize or we can upscale. So there EIT play a role So maybe when these projects finish, maybe on recycling or waste. So we have a number of cases of upscaling these kind of projects. So the project coordinators or the partners here may have a look at it and come back to us if you have a good project idea. And so where it all started, last few years or couple of decades, China has taken, or we have given up, our capability in the mining and processing sector. If you look at all previous speakers referred to this, if you look at this, China dominate the whole value chain from mining to the end product. Then on the behind, everyone wake up to this call, US, EU, and UK. Then there have been a number of initiatives and policies, as previous speakers mentioned, and especially in EU, what we latest is being the implementation or the introduction of the Critical Raw Material Act, largely led by the DigiGrow, and where we have certain benchmark to be achieved. Not sure if it is applicable to all critical raw materials, but maybe we'll achieve something in certain specific materials. So for example, on the mining sector, we have the mandate on recycling and processing, etc., and also on sourcing. So where EIT is also aligned its funding schemes and also facilitation and policy-oriented stuff to keep up with the overall EU strategic objectives. So for example, in the past few years, EIT has spent about 600 million since its beginning, 2015 afterwards, past 10 years. It has given up, invested in 600 million across the value chain and supported about 1,400 pilots, largely left over from the Horizon projects or kind of a services of these Horizon projects. And also, if you look at the products launched, about 300 new products and services, many success stories, not only by small startups companies accelerated, but also within the big corporates like Boliden or Eramet. They have received part of the multi-consortium funding that they have been scaling up to make the EU critical raw material sector more sustainable, more de-risking, etc. And then I come to my topic, rare earths, as everyone speak, is no more just commodity, it's a strategic project, and geopolitics run this. We have been seeing this in China, started with China, now it's more on geopolitics, what's happening in China, and etc. And there was a second, all this started, everyone heard about the rare earth crisis when it happened in 2010, but there have been, for us, several wake-up calls. So the latest being in around April, May, that China suddenly stopped export of these heavy rare earths. That's very highly critical, not only for defense, but also on the motors, for example, where you need high-efficient permanent magnets. So, and then on the behind, we also, especially in EU, we also have, fighting going on in Russia and Ukraine. Then the Trump targeting specifically, outright political, statements like buying Greenland, for example. There's a lot of, critical raw material projects and also rare earth projects, but also dealing, on Ukraine's resources. And so this is, I mentioned the crisis in 2010. So if you look at, nothing has changed since the first crisis. We still depend on China for almost 100% of our critical raw material requirements. And you have seen the ups and downs of the prices that also largely connected to what usually happens with Chinese influences or Chinese strategic thinking. But what actually happened, but China has changed over these 15 years, its rare earth strategy. So China has become, if you look at the trade statistics, China has become a net importer. It's not that suddenly they became the net importer. It's the same trend we have witnessed in other base metals like copper, nickel, copper, aluminum, or steel. but it's also same story that is being repeated in rare earths. So for example, if you look at the Chinese processing capacity now, almost half of that raw material, is sold from outside. China started with stone mining industry for rare earths. Then over the years, they also started to source the external sources. So I give reference to what Keane mentioned before. For example, in US, it's more profitable to keep the resources in ground for the companies. But for rare earth, if you look at the Australian or largely, if in the global rare earth business, most of them are, ASX listed or Toronto listed companies, all these junior mining companies. So once they develop the project, so it has become that it has become more profitable to send your concentrate to China, and rather than you develop the mine and you have the processing capacity, because you won't be able to compete with that, that stage. So you will not have any margin if you mine it and process it and try to sell it in Western world. So China has done some policies in that sector, like VAT refunding, no tax on what you import, and such kind of strategy. So basically, what makes it that we all big all companies are for profit, but if it is incentivized that it's allow you to send your concentrate and sell it higher margin, then it allows you to process it here and sell. So this is why what is Chinese strategy. So to compete with that, so how we keep our resources, or how we enable our industry to be profitable by in domestically, this is a bigger question. And also it comes with China doesn't care about where the material comes. You look at the countries they import, all the African countries, whether Congo, Rwanda, but interestingly also countries like Myanmar, especially for heavy rare earths, almost 75% of the heavy rare earths, if you look at the sources, comes from countries like Myanmar, and China do a double. So in Myanmar, certain part of the Myanmar is controlled by the rebel groups, like in Kachin state, where conflict ongoing. So China actually facilitate both groups. So if you make a profit, they facilitate, they sell the arms. There have been Guardian, BBC reports on this. They sell arms to both sides. They also align with the junta. So they don't care about, they actually care about their companies and their resources. But the problem is that, and we are also aligned, our downstream companies are getting this material from China. The permanent magnet you import from China, actually a source of heavy rare earths that's originate from these countries. So we need to communicate this. We need to highlight this to the downstream companies. And actually, it's also, if you do this and make some policies, also help our companies, like, there are some couple of rare earth companies here, like Thomas. Now, if recycling is the case, if you have the heavy rare earths, so now it's not profitable compared to Chinese price. If you have say that this is the issue, then our companies should be downstream of the offtake. Okay, we have the heavy rare earth source from a recycled circular economy perspective, maybe a little bit higher price than Chinese price. Okay, this is the case because we need to diversify. So this is, this kind of forums will help us to communicate this. This is so it's not much change in last half year. Same business as usual as happening. And then. Then what I said, by this incentivizing, we are all buying the refined product from China, whether US or EU and others, that we are incentivized to buy the refined products from China. We send our concentrate from these countries, then China refined it, and we get the resources. And then it's not about the problem of the mining. Maybe we have the mining. Our companies are mining, for example, in some developed South Africa or in other countries, but it's also about, it's not about how it's differentiated. Keane mentioned it. It's not about oil and gas. It's not one step of the refining. If you want to make a final product of a permanent magnet, how many steps are there? So we have some capability and capacity, but not that level. that, and also there are challenges in EU, UK, and US of the workforce, the talent. We have all drained this, so we need to rebuild this. And this is huge because if you look at the capacity need to compete with China, for example, EU, huge 25,000 tons of permanent magnets that, including UK, imported, from China. So 25,000 tons of magnets is at least, if you say, maybe is 10, 15, manufacturers. Because on an average, if you look at Chinese magnet manufacturers, on an average, all they have a capacity of 3,000 tons of permanent magnet annual capacity of a factory. So see how many workforce that we lose. And so this is being used as a geopolitical tool for a strategic thinking. If you say something and if you are not aligned with Chinese policies, they can screw you. They can stop you. Yeah. So there have been some policies like in US. You cannot source Chinese permanent magnet for the defense industry, the defense procurement companies, no more. Yeah. So they're being incentivized in US, but also maybe in EU something maybe coming up is that maybe made in EU magnets that for the wind industry, when you go for the offshore kind of bid, that there have been specific laws that could target certain percentage of your permanent magnets should come from locally sourced companies. So that's how kind of indirect incentives you can provide. And some this is also past. The demand keep going on. I also look at some statistics on past 6 months. It's normal. Is same, that same demand going on for coming years on the permanent magnet sector. And what has, and if you look at the rare earth supply chain, there have been few projects a bit less active compared to US, ongoing in EU, but they are, especially if you look at the mining projects, they are a bit far, maybe will not be able to achieve the targets in the CRMA. For example, a project in Finland or LKAB project in Sweden, they are on pipeline, but it's on way. But we also have recent announcement of Solvay has been, for example, a traditional player, the French-Belgium company, a traditional player in the rare earth processing, but they have scaled down because of the competition from China. They also have plant in China, but now they want to come back and upscale their processing capacity. But also a broke-down group, Keroster, has been selected for the strategic projects. So they're also into this business. And there are also a couple of magnets companies building the pilot line, like Orano, going to launch their pilot scale in a couple of days. And also, Mag Resources, that EIT raw materials also supported, and Hypromag, both in Germany and UK. So there are some of the companies, we could have at least certain percentage of our Western supply chain diversified in a couple of years. And then, so what has been, I also look at the funding scheme of the EU at large. So, for example, if compared to US, what we have been focusing on was on funding these R&D projects on recycling, processing, for example, recovering critical raw materials from waste streams, or high efficient processing kind of things, and especially for rare earths, also for EIT. Almost 500 million in past 10 years has been funded, but we are not yet. Some of them has been able to upscale to move a little bit on the commercialization or pilot line, but still that's need to be done to reach to a level of diversification. So this some of the Horizon projects plus EIT projects. So for example, in some of these within this project, we have. For example, NURE was a EIT funded project, and that's moved to a Horizon project. Now they also got a tag of strategic projects. So we specifically, it's led by the Italian recycling company called Italium and Erion, for example. So we also gradually we are moving, helping to commercialize what has been achieved in these projects. And so this is, for example, a list of EU strategic projects. Ludivine mentioned, or others also mentioned about the EU strategic projects. Vague, broad concepts, but there are something going inside of how to align with different EU nationals on how to move forward, how to fasten the permitting processes. If you look at these 47 EU critical strategic projects, if you look at 17 or 19 out of them also have been funded by the EIT raw materials, either to start up or to commercialize the concept, or also on other aspects. So we have been well aligned with these EU strategic projects, and also in future we'll also EIT funding will be also more give preference. That's what our mandate will give, more preference to EU strategic projects. Yeah. So this kind of alignment with the large EU policies. But if you look at the US, a different story. Now, of course, there have been R&D funding by the DOE or different arms of the DOE, but also there have been large commercial capital-based funding in the US side, a bit different. If you look at, I said the total EU import of the permanent magnet, including UK, is 25,000 tons, but if you look at US market, it's only about 7,000 tons. Still, there are 7 ongoing clear big projects ongoing in US for the permanent magnet, for example, and most of them, I think 100% of them, have received some kind of national funding from the US government, and the big case is now the MP materials, $1 billion offer from the DoD that and Keane mentioned, but also that Thomas' question before the offtake agreement, and that's also aligned with an offer from the GE that whatever they produce, GE has an in-house offtake agreement with this deal. So you're bringing kind of a different state mechanism that U.S. and Trump administration is showing. Maybe something we should also work in EU. And so that's the latest. So otherwise, if you look at other permanent magnet projects or rare earth projects, that most of them have received almost 500 million, especially for the capital intensive or operational cases. So this is a bit different from compared to what EU has done in previous years. And so in the EIT side, we have been looking at this sector quite strategically. So what we identify, we made a recommendation just before for the strategic projects that what we, first of all, we in this critical raw material sector, especially on rare earth, we don't have a level playing field. So the companies are not competing with companies. Yeah, EU or Western companies are not competing with Chinese companies. We are competing with Chinese state. So that's you have to identify first. So you need to have the state support to have a viable industry in Europe. So we need we have to create a level playing field, and then the question of the offtake, such as our capabilities in the OEMs and the downstream. So we need to have the build what US GE and Ford has been helping the US industry there. So especially we have seen this in the battery sector a little bit, but not in rare earth and other critical material sector. So we need to have a kind of taking along the OEMs and downstream sector to build this, because it's not the problem of one single value chain, it's the problem of the whole value chain. Yeah, so we need to have the higher commitment from these companies, and also we have other mandate like Circular Economy Act or critical raw material. So we all talking about circular economy in West. But also the end of life products. The history has been that all these end of life products end up in somewhere else outside the Western countries. So you need to, for example, Enzo would understand the difficulty, or also Thomas would understand difficulty of getting enough feedstock to have a viable recycling industry. Where is this feedstock? So we need to make sure that your end-of-life products, especially for example the wind turbines, this kind of things stay here. That feedstock is available to our industry, and especially provide capex, state-funded capex. So this is some of the things that we should do, and we also did a kind of an estimate to have real investment, how much we would require to have a viable rare earth value chain here in Europe. So we identified that at least we need in short term at least from mining to separation, we need at least 500 to 1,000 billion investment urgent to have some viable processing industry in EU, and also on refining reduction process on the metallization stage, we need about 30 to 40 million. This is the input that we really interacting with the players in the market, and so this is kind of a kind of scenario that we would require, especially in EU, to have a viable rare earth full permanent magnet value chain. And thank you for listening. If you have any question, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you, Nabeel.
Yeah.
Yes, if there is anyone.
Okay, just hi. Thank you for the presentation. The rare earths are the, let's say, flagship of the critical raw materials in Europe, and I have a question, but on the other hand, it's a bit for a further discussion, because current situation is like we are not producing rare earths or not processing rare earths, to be honest, because we don't have the sources. Let's say mines. The US had the mines in 60s and the processing capabilities, and they were producing the rare earths, magnets and everything. But then what happened? The price dropped because everything dirty production was moved to China. Yeah, so we're doing exactly the same in other industries as well. So the thing is, if you even recover the magnets from the scrap, even, because we're not doing that anyway, that's another issue. And then if we can process them in Europe, but the price is higher from China, you will sell it to China, just like you and the colleague before said. So I think, that's the question. Can we make more profitable recycling of magnets and keep them in Europe, just like as you mentioned, instead of shipping them elsewhere? Then the normal economy will just balance itself. Yeah. That's really the case. So can we do anything about the profitability? I know it's tricky because, as you mentioned, we're competing with China, like a government, not the company. Yeah? So.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, if you want to have certain kind of de-risk supply chain, so this has to come from my personal. That has to come from two sides. One set of commitment from the government side, okay, you incentivize if the OEMs or the customers are, if the customers are incentivized to source locally, especially with regard to circular economy or recycled content. So then you should be able to cover that cost difference between what is Chinese price and what is the locally sourced content price, and so that should be done, and also the OEMs the downstream should also pay a premium of this sustainably sourced material from locally sourced. So this could be, and for the OEMs to cover that cost, maybe a certain third aspect should come from the state. Okay, incentivizing the OEMs. For example, if Vestas or somebody is bidding for an offshore component somewhere, you have to mandate, okay, if you want to gain the bidding, so you have to show, okay, localization. So these are different policies going all over the world. If I look at India or Turkey, they have all this localization, content. So we should also do the same thing. Maybe in larger term, is it against market, our long-standing policies of free market? Yeah, but the world is not anymore. That, doesn't work that way. So we have to, be in that situation now. Yeah. Any? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Nabeel. I think we'll have to stop here. Thank you again. Because the coffee is waiting for you outside, and I guess it's better to profit of that. We can maybe make it until 11:10, let's say 11:10, 15, so that we don't run out of time later. Thank you.